I'm Sandra Craine. I'm the daughter of two Holocaust survivors. I learned at an early age the importance of remembrance. This is what compels me and makes it my obligation to tell you the story of my family. Every survivor story is unique. Survivor testimony has the greatest impact on understanding the Holocaust. So I'm going to tell you and share my mom's story. My mom and her four siblings survived enormous hardships. They were robbed of their family, youth, education, health, and dignity, but they defied all odds and survived with resilience and spirit. My mom always saw the world as a blessing, and even in the most difficult circumstances, her optimism never waned. I am the guardian of my family's story. By sharing their story, I'm preserving history. My mother, Bela Garfinkel, was born on May 15, 1921, in a small town, Chmelnik, Poland. It is a small town dating back to the 16th century with a Jewish community. The town was famous for its geese and down feathers, which were exported to the U.S. to make beds and pillows. Before World War II, 12,000 Jews lived in Chmelnik. By the end of the war, only 500 Jews survived. Today, there are no Jews remaining in Chmelnik. My mother's parents were Sarah and Kalman. They were observant Jews who created a kind, traditional, and loving family. My grandfather, Kalman, was a miller who bought corn, barley, and oats, and grains that were taken to a mill, ground, and eventually sold as bread. My grandmother, Sarah, who I was named after, was characterized by her children as devoted, hardworking, and resourceful. My grandparents lived in the city of Lodz. My mom was the eldest in a family of 7 children. My mom, Nathan, and the older brother and the 2 other sisters slept in the kitchen. The house was so small that the kitchen functioned as a living room by day and a bedroom by night. My mom grew up hearing her father say these encouraging words: "School is important. You can lose everything, but the things you learn, you can never lose." Education was always emphasized. My mom and her siblings remember many anti-Semitic incidents prior to the war. Anti-Semitism existed in Poland and all over Europe before the war. The Nazis exploited centuries of hatred. Jews were not allowed to pursue higher education, hold government jobs. They were forbidden to go to public places, and there were boycotting signs everywhere. In 1933, at the age of 12, my mother was sent to Lodz, 100 miles away, to live with her maternal grandparents. Lodz at that time was the second largest Jewish community in pre-war Poland and a large textile center. My mother graduated high school with high honors. She was fluent in Polish, German, and Yiddish. She always regretted that the war interrupted her education. Although the Garfinkels heard rumors about Nazi Germany, no one could truly believe them. No one wanted to leave their home. Their knowledge of world affairs and information came primarily from newspapers. They didn't even own a radio. My mom was still in Lodz when, just 3 days after the outbreak of war, the Nazis marched into Chmelnik on September 4, 1939. After the Nazis entered Chmelnik, life changed drastically for the Jews. Businesses owned by Jews were only allowed to open on Saturday, which is the Sabbath. While my grandfather refused to open, Nathan and another sister opened the store to maintain their livelihood. Additional restrictions were placed on the Jews. A few days after the invasion, soldiers raided the neighborhood and dragged 5 families, including the Garfinkels, to stage an execution to scare the Jewish residents into submission. They were lined up facing machine guns. They were humiliated and then allowed to return home. Following the invasion, the Nazis imposed new laws governing the Jews. There were strict curfews, rules against working and attending school. They had to give up their radios, money, and precious items to the Nazis. My mother recalls that her father, a devout religious man, was stopped on the street by Nazis. They cut off his beard with a bayonet and beat him. Afterwards, Kalman, my grandfather, was so ashamed that he covered his bare chin with a scarf. Now, that's not my grandfather, but it is an example of the violent types of actions that were happening everywhere. In 1941, the Khmelnyk Ghetto was established. A ghetto is a small, confined area where Jews were forced to live in squalid, crowded conditions, separated from the non-Jewish population. The sign says, "Entering this residential area of the Jews is forbidden." My grandparents, Sarah, Kalman, and 7 children faced food restrictions, witnessed daily beatings and shootings. My mom and her sisters often risked their lives by sneaking out and going out beyond the ghetto wall to sell their mother's beautiful embroidered linens for food. In October 1942, all young adults were ordered to report to the square to be deported. The Nazis had scheduled this transport on the Jewish holiday of Sukkot to deliberately humiliate the Jews. The siblings, Nathan and Sonia, left their family and did report to the town square. My mom remained at home because she had a rash on her hands and arms. A few hours after they left, their mother, Sarah, sent Helen, the younger sister, after them to deliver socks and sandwiches wrapped in paper. Helen was so shocked to see the Nazis brandishing their rifles and pushing people into waiting trucks. Helen was pushed and prodded into the truck, despite her cries, "I'm too young." My mom and her parents were heartbroken, not knowing the fate of their family members. The siblings, Nathan and Sonia, were deported and interned in the Hasig labor factory, working under very, very harsh conditions from 1942 to 1944, making bullets and explosives to fuel the German weapon-making industry. These camps provided a steady labor force for the Nazis. The Hasig slave labor network had 8 factories in Germany and 3 factories in Poland. Later, in 1942, the Nazis rounded up the remaining Jews from their homes in the ghetto. The Nazis separated the young from the elderly. Regina, one of the younger siblings, had snuck out of the ghetto to buy food during the roundup. Regina was so small and didn't look Jewish, so when she returned and she saw her parents and 2 younger siblings, Fischel and Rachel, in the truck, Regina waved frantically, wishing to join them. Her parents ignored her pleas in an effort to save her. And later, they learned that their parents and younger siblings, Fischel and Rachel, were deported to Treblinka and were gassed upon arrival. Regina and my mom were herded into trucks bound for Kels, another munition factory 18 miles from their home. Regina was only 12 years old, and my mother was 21 years old. My mom and Regina worked together 12 hours daily in the Hasig factory, making bullets and grenades to meet the growing demand for the Nazi quota. Their hands and their feet were always covered in oil from the machines. Oftentimes, my mom made Regina stand on a box so she could look taller during the roll call. My mom protected her kid sister, Regina. She rarely talked to Regina about the darkness of their condition. My mom tried to bolster her sister with optimism, never mentioning the parents or the siblings. She comforted Regina with the words, "It's going to be okay. Tomorrow will be better." My mom kept up their spirits by singing Yiddish and Polish songs. My mom, like a mother, devoted herself to protect Regina. They lacked food, shelter, and medical care. Their lives depended on the whims of their captors. Kels is the same town when, after the war, a pogrom occurred where neighbors were watching Jews being injured and slaughtered. In the late summer of 1944, my mom and her younger sister were deported to another bullet factory at Czestochowa. When they arrived at their new destination, they found their 3 siblings who had been imprisoned there. This was a miraculous reunion. The 5 siblings cried and rejoiced together. They were the envy of the camp, having found family and beating the odds. My mom and Regina were assigned to the same factory, and they slept on wooden planks of wood in the same barracks with the sisters Helen and Sonia. The barracks were very primitive. It had no windows. The prisoners were often working back-breaking their day and night shifts. Their world revolved around work and bread. Surviving depended on masking their emotions, especially the pain and anger, in front of their sadistic guards. After 6 months in Czestochowa in January 1945, the 4 sisters endured a grueling 3-day train ride to another concentration camp, Bergen-Belsen in Germany. The 4 sisters thought this was the last stop to end their short lives. The camp was designed to hold 10,000 prisoners. Near war's end, more than 60,000 prisoners were detained. All basic services, food, water, sanitation, had collapsed. Nathan, the brother, had already been separated and sent to Buchenwald, one of the largest concentration camps in Germany. Upon arrival, they were forced into a freezing shower, given wooden clogs, and striped, ill-fitting garments. This was their last shower before liberation 4 months later. They remained in Bergen-Belsen for 3 or 4 weeks. Then they were marched to Turkum and then to Burgos, where they worked in an airplane factory in the woods assembling parts. They received bread only 2 or 3 times a week due to the disruption of supplies at the end of the war. Had they stayed in Bergen-Belsen, the odds of surviving would be 0. Bergen-Belsen is the same camp where Anne Frank and her sister Margot died. Here is an actual registration list from Bergen-Belsen. It was taken from the archives. Although it's hard to see, you can see the name, hometown, and assigned number of my mother. Here we see another card showing internment at Dachau. And this demonstrates how the Nazis kept meticulous records. Later, my mother and her 3 sisters were forced on a torturous death march towards Allach, a subcamp of Dachau. And you can see here, this picture was secretly photographed by someone living in that house. And we can see women on the death march. They endured constant exposure to the cold. The sisters walked in a semi-conscious state. They satiated their thirst by opening their mouths. Years later, my mom summed up the march. No place to sleep, no food, filthy, dirty. A dog is treated better in America. You buy cookies for a dog. For the Nazis, we were Untermenschen, less than dogs. The sisters could hardly walk. My Aunt Regina, the youngest, was supported by the three sisters. One night, they collapsed in a ditch, expecting to be shot or die from exhaustion. Lying in the comfort of mud, they tilted their faces and opened their mouths to catch drops of rain. They held hands and promised each other they would all live together or die together. The Nazis were guarding them, but didn't shoot anyone because of the approaching Americans. Soon, American planes flew overhead. They were liberated in April 1945. Here is a picture of liberation with the survivors rejoicing. At the liberation of Buchenwald, another concentration camp, General Dwight Eisenhower instructed soldiers to take photos. He called Washington and London instantly to send newspaper journalists and other groups to write about and take pictures to capture the atrocities. He wanted first-hand evidence. He wanted the world to see what other human beings could do to others. This evidence would leave no room for doubt or denial. Of the gruesome sights, he said, I have never been able to describe my emotional reactions when I first came face to face with the indisputable evidence of Nazi brutality and ruthless disregard of every shred of decency. I have never experienced an equal sense of shock. Over the next few months, the siblings were in hospitals recovering from typhus, malnutrition, and the trauma of being in camps. My mother weighed 67 pounds. They had to recover physically and emotionally and to continue to regain their lives. The Nazis had deliberately created unsanitary conditions in the camps as another way to murder Jews. Here we see a DP camp. A DP camp is a place for displaced persons, those coming out of camps with no place to go. This camp, Funk Kasserine, was originally a German Air Force base. In this camp, the siblings shared one room and received Red Cross packages. They saw themselves as orphans and refugees with no home to return. My Aunt Regina, then 15 years old, in this camp was given one dress and then another. And she said, what am I going to do with two dresses? Slowly, the sisters came to terms that they would never see their parents and young siblings again. And here is a record from the displaced persons camp in 1945. And you can see the names of Bela, Sonia, Regina, and Helen Garfinkel, and you see their place of birth, Khmelnyk. My mom met my dad at a train station. My father, Sal, was born in 1916 in Kobrin, Belarus. He was a survivor of camps and partisan activities. In 1939, when he was a young Polish soldier, he returned home to find his entire family gone, parents, sister, and nephew. And after my parents met, here is their wedding picture. In 1946, they were married in a DP camp. It was one of many DP camps' weddings, and it was affirmation of life, of survivors looking to the future. I was born a year later. Here I am again in Germany. We were sponsored by my father's uncle in New York, Brooklyn, New York, to immigrate. In July 1949, we boarded the USAT Stuart Heinzelman to America. And this is how we came to Brooklyn, our first home. And this is a picture of my parents and myself on the boardwalk. My mother missed her sisters too much. One sister had moved to Detroit, and all the siblings followed. They remembered their promise on the death march to stay together. The goal was always to be close to one another, and they were. Regina and her family lived across the street from us. Sonia, Nathan, and their families moved a few blocks away. I learned through their deep connection to one another the value of family. My aunts and uncles were a great source of love and comfort to me. They were my surrogate grandparents. Here's a picture of me and my sister in Detroit. Renee, my sister, was born in 1952, and she was named after my father's mother. My mom's optimism, her indomitable spirit, and ability to frame her life not as a victim, but as a victor, helped her lead a fulfilling life. My mother taught me to enjoy the simple things in life, family and tradition. Those values have shaped my life. I am very close to my beloved sister and was very attached to my aunts, uncles, and cousins. My mom and her siblings overcame insurmountable odds and transcended the dehumanizing, suffering years to live productive lives and maintain loving relationships. And as a result, I take their legacy of hope and resilience and instill that meaning into my family, to my 2 children and 4 grandchildren. And here are my 4 grandchildren. The Holocaust was not inevitable. There were warning signs. Individual governments, individuals, people, organizations made choices. They remained silent and allowed the Holocaust to happen. So why am I telling you this story? We need to know the facts of the Holocaust and the implications of these lessons. People need to understand that we are all at risk when anti-Semitism and hatred are allowed to grow and flourish. What will you do when confronted with hate speech or acts of discrimination? We need to understand the awful consequences of anti-Semitism, prejudice, and racism. Speak out when you hear or see something unacceptable. Keeping silent is dangerous. Saying nothing emboldens hate. As a citizen in a democracy, this is your responsibility and obligation. I want to take a minute to read this very famous quote from Pastor Martin Niemöller. First, they came for the communists, and I didn't speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I was not a Jew. Finally, they came for me, and there was no one left to speak. Let us remember that never again begins with all of us. Hate can knock on your door. Silence is dangerous because it spreads the notion that the problems of your neighbors are not your problem. I'm Sandra Craine, and thank you again for listening to my family's story. I hope this gives you inspiration for future generations. Thank you.